everyone, and welcome to another video on the ToLiss Airbus A321, and today we're doing another Q&A, so we'll be answering some of the questions that have come out of my recent videos. I'm a real-world Airbus pilot, so hopefully this can provide some extra context to your home flight simulations. As ever, this is not for any real-world use. There are some differences in Explain, and obviously in the real world you're going to use your airline's procedures and manuals. This could all be out of date by the time you watch this, for example. So let's get started. So for this Q&A, we're going to be based in Geneva. So what we'll do is fly an arrival into Geneva, and then I'm going to show you some things on the takeoff. And as we go through, we'll answer some questions that have come up, which I will post into the description as well, so you can skip to that part of the video if that's all you're looking for an answer for. So the first question I'm going to answer is to do with being able to put in a waypoint at a distance. It came from Burek, who asked whether we could put in a distance as a waypoint. So if air traffic said, I want you to be level 10 miles before Lusar, or let's put it as 5 miles before Lusar, can I do that? And you can. So if I go to the top left, fix info, Lusar, and then put in a radius of 5, draws that little 5-mile ring, and then if I stick in that, or press next to that little arrow again, it draws the waypoint there, and then I can insert. I want to be heading track, so I'll do that. Insert, there's the waypoint, nav. And you can do that for any distance. I could put in 12, or I could put in 10, so let's change it to 12. Radius 12, again back into heading, put it in, and there's our 12 point, insert. So that way we could then make sure that we are level by those waypoints. As I've said in previous videos, the real airplane, of course we can go back into nav, the real airplane does allow us to see our vertical profile a bit more clearly than the ToLiss currently does. It will give you arrows to show you where you're going to level off or start your climb and so on, in which case we would see exactly where we'd level off and know that we're going to make it by that point. So that's one way of doing it. I haven't been able to make it do it in the ToLiss, but there is also a way to type in a waypoint. So in the real airplane, you would type in Lusar /-10, and it would put the waypoint there at 10 miles before. It doesn't seem to work in the ToLiss at the moment. If anyone else has a way of doing it, please let me know, because there are lots of variations on the FMGC. So if I don't know how to do it, that doesn't mean it isn't 100% possible. It just could be that it's not the way I'm familiar with. There's also, in the real Airbus, you can type in a time. So it's currently 1416 Zulu. If I wanted a reminder at 1420 Zulu, I could type in 1420, put it in. And it'd be possible to have that little timer appear on the green line at that time where it expects it to be. And that could be useful if you're flying to an airport or into airspace that requires you to notify them of your arrival early. So some airspaces will say 15 minutes before entering the airspace, you must contact us on this frequency, that sort of thing. So that could be useful for that. So there we go. Hopefully that's answered that question. The next question I want to answer is about holding speeds. This came from Thomas, who asked, can you adjust the holding speed when we reach a certain waypoint? So if I had Learco, is it possible for me to put a hold in there and change the speed? So let's put in a hold, Learco, and we're going to arrive on 101. So let's just do 101 right hand turns. I know it's not an official holding point, but it'll just prove the point. So there we go, there's our hold. And we can see here the speed it expects us to be, so 250 knots, and at Learco 260, 58, so it's reducing that now because the Airbus is going to automatically want to try and hold at a decelerated speed near to green dot. So it should hold a green dot if you manage the speed. Certainly if you've activated the approach phase, of course, and you manage the speed, then it will be green dot as long as you're clean, so you have no flaps out. So is it possible to type in a speed? Well, I can put in a speed constraint at Learco. So if I do that now, speed constraint. So I've selected on the right key next to Learco, and I could put in, let's say, it currently says 250. Let's say I want it to be 210. And now we can see Learco, it still has 220 and then reducing as you enter the hold. But what will happen is it would just revert to green dot in the hold. So my experience with the ToLiss so far has been pretty much that you could type in a speed constraint at the waypoint to force the airplane to slow down earlier, but ultimately once you go into manage speed in the hold, it will try and fly at green dot. In the hold, you wouldn't really, they typically have speed limits of 220 knots, so you'd either fly in selected speed at 220 or whatever the speed limit is, or slower if you can, because we don't want to be fast in the hold. The faster we're going above green dot, the more fuel we're going to burn. So that's why it's not really worth trying to select any different speed. If you can go at green dots, that's great. some pilots won't like it because if you're close to green dot and you get slow in a turn, you might see alpha protection and the other low speed restrictions coming up towards your green dot, and that can be a little uncomfortable. So in turbulence or anything like that, pilots will often add a few knots. So they would do that in selected speed. So now as we approach the hold, we see this little magenta dots here, which is going to be our deceleration point. So as I'm in managed speed, I put in that 220 knot restriction, but I'm expecting it to reduce speed probably to its holding speed, so green dot. So let's see what it does. So there we go. That's proven me slightly wrong. It's gone to 210 knots. So I'm interested to see what speed it will revert to. So it's doing 210 knots because I told it I want 210 at Learco, but then it's going to enter the hold, and I suspect the holding speed, as we can see here, it says 213, which is pretty close to green dot. So I think it's going to get a bit slow and then go back to green dot once it enters the actual hold. Nothing too shocking. There we go. So it's gone to green dot as we go past the hold. So I don't think there's a way to actually change the speed in the hold unless you were to select it. While we're in the hold, I would like to answer another question that came up from Thomas as well, asking about the arrival names. So we've got different sort of numbers and letters for certain ILSs and so on, and how do we know which one we should expect to get? So what I'm going to do is just pick another airport for now. So I'm going to go LIPZ, which will be Venezia, and let's have a look at what ILSs it has on offer. So approach, and you can see here we've got ILS Zulu, ILS Yankee, ILS X-Ray. Basically, the different letters will be highlighting the difference between those procedures. So the ILS Zulu or Yankee could have different a basis of a different VOR for a certain part of the approach. They could have different missed approaches. One could be nighttime, one could be daytime. There's loads and loads of different things that can change between an ILS because obviously they're quite complicated and carefully planned procedures. So let's have a look. If we go for the ILS Zulu, 04 right, we can see down we come, and then we fly this sort of RNAV go around to these waypoints and out to a hold at Accardo. But if we look at the ILS Yankee, 04 right, which you think would be the same, it's got a completely different hold, and it's based off this DME arc, and then background, and they go around 2 miles and out here and into the hold based on the TES VOR. So RNAV transitions, RNAV 1, so you'll see that this one actually requires an RNAV equipment, basically. So for RNAV systems with holding functionality and so on, because it's using these waypoints that aren't based off of VORs, it's not using a DME arc. Whereas the Yankee is a little bit more traditional, and you can fly that without RNAV. DME is required, but it doesn't need RNAV as such. Now, obviously, the Airbus is very RNAV capable, but that would be one example of why you might have different letters and numbers. The Zulu should be the most used procedure. So if you're not sure, say you're flying to an airport, but if everything else is working and operational, you would expect typically the Zulu ILS or VOR or whatever procedure it is, as that is the procedure they expect to use most commonly. You might find that if a VOR is unserviceable or something like that where you're flying to, in that case they may need to use the other procedure. So if this go around, the first go around, for example, on the Zulu procedure is based on a VOR, and then that VOR is unserviceable, it could be that there's another procedure like a Yankee or an X-ray that uses a different VOR for the go around, that sort of thing. That's quite common. Another example of this would be at London Heathrow. So if I bring that up for you. And here we are looking at the charts for Heathrow. I've got the RNAV approaches, runway 27 left, RNAV Yankee 27 left, and I've got RNAV Zulu 27 left. So if we look at the Yankee 27 left, firstly, it's temporary. Secondly, the approach gradient is 3.2 degrees. If I go to the RNAV Zulu for 27 left, hopefully you can see that, the approach gradient is 3 degrees. So that's quite a big difference between the two. It's not always immediately obvious, so you do have to take some time to check the charts and find out what's wrong, and that's why it's quite important that we check we're both briefing and setting out from the right chart, as well as making sure you've got the right arrival in the ILS, in the MCDU. The approaches into Geneva are all listed as the same, so thankfully we don't have to worry about that for this. The next question is with regards to noise abatement procedures. It came from Airbus Aviator, and they were asking about how reliable are noise abatement procedures, how often are they applied? So, and also where would we find them? And here we are in Geneva on the ground, as you can see, runway 04, ready for takeoff. And to find our noise abatement, I will just close the chart so we can find it again. We would look into the airport we're in, so obviously in Geneva, and we've got all these different options. And if we go to airport, and it'd be one of the, for our departure noise abatement, one of the airport briefing departure. So if I try departure continued 1, start procedures, and then we see here noise abatement. It could be in any number of sections, and not all airports have them. But here we go, this is what they ask for. So an example here in Geneva is follow strictly the published SID for runway 22 and 04 in order to minimize noise around Geneva Airport. Airbus Aviator was asking specifically about Birmingham. If we go to Birmingham, Echo Golf Bravo Bravo, and we have a look at their noise abatement procedures, there aren't actually any specific ones that I could find. So if we go airport briefing departure, but what they ask is for other procedures, which is noise preferential routings, and they've got different tracks, for example, depending on the turn. So this sort of noise abatement procedure is fine, but it's slightly more specific and local to the airports. What this means is just finding a route away from the nearby houses and so on. So a SID, a planned SID, would typically include the noise abatement. We have specific noise abatement procedures that we will apply to certain airports if they require them. Otherwise, flying the SIDs should mostly account for that. So most SIDs in busy airports, especially with towns nearby, will have noise point recordings, that sort of thing, and they'll know how to plan them to make sure that we don't bust any noise limits. And they do check. They have recorders that will monitor the sound levels, and they can place it so they'll know if somebody has broken the noise abatement. So it is monitored, especially in busier airports. So these instructions here, in a day-to-day line flight as an airline pilot, to be honest with you, I wouldn't expect to be following or taking as much notice of these. I'm more likely to be following the SID carefully. This is sort of talking about other sort of departures. For example, if you were flying out VFR, something like that. And if we go to Geneva, and we look here, we've got noise abatement. This one has slightly different. So again, strictly follow the SID. As I said, that's the main way we sort out the noise and keep ourselves away from disturbing people on the ground. And then it has this little note here. Use the following for jet and propeller aircraft. Take off up to 2,900 feet. Use takeoff power. V2 plus 10 or 20, depending on the climb gradient limitation. And then from 2,900 to 4,400, use climb power. And then V2 plus 10 still, and then we can clean up above 4,400 and accelerate. So essentially, what that talks about is, if you look at the fact we're already at 1,400 feet, that means 2,900 feet is about 1,500 feet above us, 4,400 feet is 3,000 feet above us. So what they want us to do is climb with our normal climb profile after takeoff, but they want us to do that up to 1,500 feet above the ground. Once we reach that, they want us to continue climbing with that climb gradient, so keeping the speed back and climbing as fast as we can, but having reduced the thrust. If you look in the MCDU, and this question's come up before as well, this thrust reduction acceleration altitude in here is set to 2920, and I haven't fiddled with that. That's just what the ToLiss has set. This is 1,500 feet above the ground, obviously, as we said, 2,900 feet, so 1,500, 1,500, and that's the default. So some airlines will use that. Airlines will have their own basic noise procedures that they will apply, and they'll set these numbers up as a standard. Lots of airlines will use 1,000 feet to reduce the thrust and accelerate. If we look at this, we can see that we want to reduce the thrust at 2.9, but we don't want to accelerate until 4.4. So I'm going to do that, 2,900, 4,400, and I can just type it in. So now we'll get the lever climb message as we pass through 2,900 feet, but it will stay in SRS until we get to 4,400 feet. And that would be a noise abatement procedure. Now, this is called a ICAO noise abatement procedure A, and this is the most common one, 1,500 feet above the ground for thrust reduction and 3,000 feet above the ground for acceleration. So flying around the Airbus, especially in Europe, I'm not so familiar with other parts of the world, obviously, that is common. It's not at every airport, only certain airports ask for it, and there's advantages and disadvantages. It would just depend on the situation at that exact airport. Obviously, like this, we'll climb at a good climb gradient, so we'll get away from the ground and we'll reduce the thrust, but we can't accelerate until later. There is another one, which would be 1,000 and 1,000, which would be noise abatement procedure B. And then there's also slightly different ones, NADP procedure 1 and 2, which are slightly different. So pretty much you can look into this part of the AOI to find out. But if you see something like this is just talking about ICAO NADP procedure A, which is pretty standard. The reality is, in Flight Simulator, obviously we could just leave it as the standard 1500. That's not unreasonable. In terms of following the other noise abatement procedures, yeah, we're pretty strict about it. So we would follow the SID properly. We'll follow any other restrictions. For example, Barcelona runway 25 left. That asks you to fly noise abatement procedure A unless you can follow the SID climb gradients and tracking properly. So if you follow the SID properly, then you don't have a problem because you'll meet the noise criteria just like that. So hopefully that answers that question. These noise abatement procedures can be overridden by safety. So obviously, for whatever reason, if we have an engine failure or something like that, then we're not going to apply any of this. This is not in place of safety. So this is something that is agreed. And as it says here, adherence to noise abatement procedures is automatically monitored. So they will monitor it, but if safety overrides it, we do what we want. If we have to use toga and we have to accelerate later or earlier or whatever we need to do, obviously we will fly the airplane first, and then if there's a noise fine, that would come later. But yeah, the reality is we try and follow these as best we can. So if an airport tells us to do noise abatement procedure A, then yeah, why wouldn't we? We can just put it in. So before we set off on that takeoff and have a look at actually flying that noise abatement procedure, just to show you the SID we've got, takes us ahead and then left and around north via Sirod. Initially clears at flight level 90. I had another question which came from Alex, and they asked, can you take off in heading mode, and how do we do that? And absolutely. So you can see here the default would be climb and nav in blue, which are armed, but we can actually pre-select a heading, and all you have to do in the Airbus is just literally move the heading boat to the heading you want. So if I set that there, 044, and now it goes into open climb because it can't do managed climb because we're off the lateral path. And we'll see as we set thrust that we'll eventually just have runway if that's available, or some other FMA like that. And then we'll take off and it will just revert to heading or runway track, something similar. If I've done that by accident and I want to put it back to nav, just go as ever to 1 dot, push towards the airplane, and we get climb and nav back. And you'll see that by pulling it, it doesn't actually revert to heading. So you've got it in nav mode. By pulling it, nothing happens. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest with you, if the airplane does that. It's quite rare to take off in heading, to be honest with you, because we're nearly always flying a SID, primarily for the noise reasons. As you've said, we don't really want to mess up the SID at all. And a place like Geneva, obviously terrain is also an issue. But yeah, if I just have to rotate it and get it to go. Right, let's have a look at the takeoff. Holding on the brakes, 50% N1. Release the brakes. 2 clicks forward. Should have started timing. And off we go. So what we'll do is we'll get airborne like normal. And you can see it's gone to SRS and runway as we'd expect. And we'll get airborne and then have a look at the noise abatement as well. 80 to 100 knots, gradually reduce the pressure, neutral at 100 knots, which we would check. And rotate. Positive climb, gear up. And you'll see their runway track. Now I'm not going to follow those flight directors because that is obviously talking nonsense. I certainly don't want to bank over that early. And there we go. It should eventually settle in. Something similar. So it's asking for 044. So I'll put it in the autopilot, just have a look at that. And there we go, it stays in runway track. And if I move this, it won't do anything until I actually pull it. And then we can put it into heading, or I can just go managed into nav. So normally we would expect at 1500 feet above the ground to accelerate as well as reduce the thrust. But see, now it just says lever climb. So back to lever climb, thrust climb on a thrust, and we're staying in SRS. If you accidentally pull, so if I was to pull a higher flight level, then it would revert to open climb. So to stop it accelerating, I would then need to pull the speed. But as we'll see here, we need to get to 4,400 and then it will automatically change into climb mode. And that would follow the noise abatement. And there we go, climb, Nose comes down, starts to accelerate and retract the flaps on schedule. I hope that's been useful for you. Something slightly different with the Q&As. There'll be more. I'm trying to do one about once a week. I've got plenty more questions to come, so if you've asked a question I haven't answered here, don't worry, I will get around to them in other videos. More streams to come, more tutorials to come, and more explanations. So thank you very much for watching. As always, it's been great having the interaction with you guys. That's why we'll keep doing these sorts of videos, and I'll see you again in another video soon. Thank you.